Evening of March 9th, 1945. Tokyo. The wind off Tokyo Bay was damp and mild, carrying with it the faint smell of salt and charcoal smoke. In Ueno Park, the first cherry blossoms were budding, their pale petals touched by lantern light as families passed beneath the branches. The sight seemed almost normal, even reassuring, as if the ancient rhythm of spring could blunt the reality of war. For 7 million people living in the capital, the rituals of life continued, cooking rice over charcoal, patching clothes, and sweeping ash from the eaves. Beneath the routines, however, ran a quiet tension. Everyone knew the bombers would return. Civilians had grown used to the rituals of air defense. At sunset, the city fell into blackout. Curtains were drawn, lamps shaded, streetcars halted. Patrols moved through alleys shouting reminders. "Shomei Keshi! Extinguish your lights!" On rooftops, families filled buckets with water and sand, each household responsible for its own firefighting kit. Children drilled in schoolyards knew how to form bucket brigades, passing ladles of water up ladders to douse incendiaries. Bamboo poles with hooked ends leaned against walls, ready to push flaming debris off wooden roofs. The city's defences were improvised, ancient in their simplicity, against weapons forged in modern furnaces thousands of miles away. Tokyo had been bombed before, but the raids had seemed tolerable. Beginning in late 1944, the new American B-29 superfortresses had crossed the Pacific from bases in the Marianas. At first they flew at 30,000 feet, attempting precision strikes on aircraft plants and engine factories. From that altitude, winds shredded formations and bombs drifted wildly. Tokyoites learned to watch the silver specks far above and note with relief how many bombs fell into empty fields or rivers. Losses and damage occurred, but the city remained intact. Government propaganda reinforced the impression. Japan's capital, vast and enduring, could withstand whatever the Americans sent. The numbers appeared to support the confidence. Tokyo sprawled across 40 wards with a population exceeding 7 million, larger than New York, larger than London. Its neighbourhoods stretched in every direction, a tangle of wooden houses and narrow streets, shops built shoulder to shoulder. Though bombing had scarred Nagoya, Osaka and Kobe, the heart of the empire still beat strongly in Tokyo. Yet that heart was fragile in ways not always recognized. Of all Tokyo's buildings, nearly 87% were wooden construction, roofed with tile or paper shingles. Fire breaks cut through districts, but they were narrow, inadequate, and often built over again by desperate families who needed space. To the Americans studying aerial photographs, the city looked less like a fortress than a tinderbox waiting for a match. On the night of March 9th, that match was already airborne. Hundreds of miles to the south, engines thundered to life on the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. There, General Curtis LeMay had transformed the U.S. 20th Air Force. Precision had failed. High-altitude bombing produced disappointing results. LeMay's solution was radical. Strip the B-29s of defensive guns to save weight, load them with incendiaries, and send them in low at altitudes between 5,000 and 7,000 feet. Instead of daylight, the attack would come at night, when Japanese defences were weakest. It would not aim at factories, but at the city itself. In Tokyo, no one yet knew of this doctrinal shift. Civilians believed they understood the rhythm of raids. Sirens would wail, planes would pass overhead, bombs would fall in clusters, and afterward the fire brigades would sweep in to extinguish the blazes. The city had endured such attacks before, and life resumed. Many families, reassured by the relative ineffectiveness of earlier strikes, decided not to evacuate despite government warnings. In neighbourhoods like Honjo and Fukagawa, working-class districts packed with wooden houses, families went to bed that night with futons spread across tatami mats, water buckets lined neatly near the door. Official broadcasts encouraged stoicism. Newspapers praised the spirit of endurance, citing the German experience of withstanding the terror bombing of Hamburg and Dresden. If Europeans could survive, Japanese propaganda insisted, the people of the emperor would prove even stronger. National unity, spiritual resolve, and discipline would protect the capital where walls and plains could not. The contrast between expectation and reality was never greater than on this night. At 10:30 p.m., residents of Tokyo believed they faced another routine air raid. Mothers hushed their children, fathers checked the rooftop water barrels, neighbours exchanged quiet nods. The air was cool, calm, almost pleasant for early March. In the darkness of Ueno Park, couples strolled beneath the cherry blossoms, whispering about rumours of peace, rumours of invasion, rumours of new weapons. But over the Pacific, the operation was already underway. That evening, 334 B-29s lifted off, each loaded with dozens of clusters of M69 incendiary bombs. These were no ordinary explosives. Each cluster held 38 small canisters filled with napalm gel. When released, the cluster split open, scattering the bomblets, which then ignited after a 3 to 5 second delay. On contact, they punched through rooftops, spreading flaming jelly across tatami mats and wooden beams. The weapons had been tested in mock Japanese villages built in Utah by the U.S. Army, designed to replicate Tokyo's dense wood and paper structures. The tests showed devastating efficiency. LeMay's plan called for waves of bombers to enter from the southeast, cross over eastern Tokyo, and saturate 16 square miles with fire. Unlike earlier raids, there would be no high-altitude precision, no selective targeting. The objective was destruction on a scale the world had never seen. In the narrow alleys of Honjo, no one imagined the scale. Housewives sat sewing by candlelight. Children slept in futons under thin blankets. A few older men gathered in tea houses, quietly discussing the war's direction. They had heard of American landings on Iwo Jima weeks earlier, of battles raging in the Philippines. But Tokyo still felt far from defeat. The capital had stood for centuries through earthquakes, fires, and disasters. Surely it would stand again. At 11 p.m., the first sirens sounded. The wail echoed across the city, familiar, almost routine. Families moved as they had been trained. Fathers checked water buckets, children pulled padded hoods over their heads, mothers gathered valuables into small bundles. In fire watch towers, air wardens scanned the horizon. Nothing yet was visible. The all clear would usually follow within an hour. But this time, the sound grew. Low, steady, rhythmic, the drone of hundreds of engines approaching. Tokyoites looked up into the night sky and saw nothing at first, only darkness. Then faint glints appeared, small moving stars coming lower than ever before. What awaited was not the familiar thud of bombs, but a storm of fire, the likes of which no one in Tokyo or in the world had ever experienced. The calm before the fire was ending. Far out over the Pacific Ocean, the first formation of B-29 superfortresses levelled off at 5,000 feet, their Pratt & Whitney engines droning in synchrony. It was just past 5:30 p.m. on March 9, 1945, at the bases on the Mariana Islands. On Guam, Saipan and Tinian, ground crews had laboured all day under tropical sun, loading fuel, arming bomb racks, stripping defensive guns from the aircraft to make room for more incendiaries. Now the machines of Operation Meeting House were airborne, 334 bombers, each carrying almost 7 tons of fire. Inside the cockpits, crews reviewed the plan. They had trained for precision, high-altitude daylight raids, but General Curtis LeMay had discarded those doctrines after months of disappointment. Japanese industry, dispersed in thousands of small workshops across urban neighbourhoods, defied pinpoint targeting, and at 30,000 feet the jet stream blew bombs off course. Accuracy was measured in miles, not yards. LeMay's new order was blunt: fly low, at night, stripped of guns, saturated with incendiaries. If the bombers flew at 5,000 feet, they would slip beneath the jet stream. The Japanese night fighters and anti-aircraft batteries, already stretched thin, would be overwhelmed. Most important of all, instead of aiming for factories, the B-29s would aim for the city itself. For the crews, it was a gamble. At low altitude, they would be visible to searchlights and vulnerable to flak. Without most of their machine guns, they would rely on speed, altitude, and numbers for protection. Yet the promise of effectiveness outweighed the risks. They were told, this raid would break the back of Tokyo. The flight north from the Marianas stretched over 1,500 miles of open ocean. Crews sat in tense silence, staring at the black waves below. Navigators checked stars through sextants. Radio operators listened to coded chatter. Co-pilots studied fuel gauges. Fuel had doomed earlier missions, with aircraft ditching short of home. This time, with lighter loads from stripped guns, range calculations looked better. The bombers climbed in staggered formation, then spread into streams as they neared Japan. Their altimeters read barely a mile above the sea, lower than crews had ever flown on combat missions. They smelled oil, felt vibration through thin aluminum skins, heard the steady beat of 4 propellers thrumming toward their target. By 11 p.m., Tokyo time, radar screens in Japan lit up. Operators reported dozens, then hundreds, of inbound contacts. Warnings rippled across the capital. Air raid sirens began their long wail. Civilians stirred, as they had on so many nights before. Buckets filled, doors closed, blackout curtains drawn. People muttered to one another, "Another raid. They will drop a few bombs and leave." But these were not a few bombs. Each B-29 carried 1,665 gallons of incendiary fuel, packed into canisters of M69 bomblets. The weapon was engineered for cities like Tokyo. Each canister burst open in mid-air, releasing 38 small cylinders that tumbled downward, their fuses igniting 3 to 5 seconds after impact. They punched through rooftops, lodged in floorboards, and spewed flaming napalm gel in 30-foot arcs. Tested in mock Japanese villages at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, the incendiaries had proved devastatingly effective. Now, for the first time, they would be unleashed on a living city. From their cockpits, American pilots saw Tokyo as a faint glow on the horizon. The capital's lights were blacked out, but the vast sprawl reflected starlight faintly, a darker blot against the sea. Crews tightened oxygen masks and checked bomb bay doors. A pilot from the 9th Bomb Group later recalled, "You could sense the size of it. Tokyo just spread forever, even in the dark. It felt like we were flying toward the center of the earth." At 11:30 p.m., the lead pathfinder plane crossed the coast. Its radar scope showed the outline of Tokyo Bay and the dark grid of streets. The bombardier flipped switches, releasing the first wave of M47 napalm bombs, liquid fire designed to ignite the tinder-dry wooden homes of the eastern wards. The bombs fell in clusters, bursting into brilliant streaks. In seconds, the city below flickered with orange. The target was set. Behind them came the main force. Streams of B-29s entered from the southeast, one after another, each opening bomb bay doors. The incendiaries cascaded downward, thousands of small firepots scattering across neighborhoods like Honjo, Fukagawa, and Sumida. To those on the ground, it seemed as if the sky itself had cracked open, raining fire. Japanese defences scrambled. Searchlights stabbed upward, groping for bombers. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, black puffs blooming in the night. A handful of fighters lifted off, but at low altitude and under heavy fire, coordination broke down. American crews later reported only sporadic opposition. For most, the greatest danger came not from Japanese guns, but from turbulence and collision, as hundreds of bombers crowded the same flight paths in darkness. Still, the plan was working. Fires kindled across eastern Tokyo. From the first wave onward, neighbourhoods lit like dry kindling. The March air was cold and dry. Winds blew from the northeast at nearly 30 miles per hour. Firefighters would later call it the devil's wind. The conditions were perfect for a firestorm. From their cockpits, airmen glimpsed the results almost instantly. "The whole city just lit up," one navigator remembered. "You could see flames spreading like rivers." We were still dropping bombs, and it was already out of control. Another crewman recalled looking back and seeing Tokyo as a furnace door swung open. On the ground, civilians struggled with bucket brigades, but the incendiaries were designed to defeat them. Water splashed on napalm only spread the flames. Bamboo poles could not dislodge burning canisters that had punched through ceilings. Within minutes, the fires merged into walls of heat. Wooden homes ignited like torches. Tatami mats smouldered, then roared. By midnight, the scale of destruction surpassed anything Tokyo had seen. The fire breaks were overwhelmed, the water lines ruptured, and the fire brigades scattered. Those who had prepared with calm resolve now faced a storm beyond imagination. Above them, the bombers kept coming. Wave after wave crossed the city, dropping incendiaries in patterns that overlapped, saturating 16 square miles. For the men in the cockpits, it was a mission, a sequence of switches, gauges, and checklists. For those below, it was the beginning of hell. And the night was still young. Midnight, March 10th, 1945. Within 30 minutes of the first incendiaries hitting Tokyo, the capital had become an open furnace. The eastern wards, Honjo, Fukagawa, Sumida, were the first to ignite. These districts, home to hundreds of thousands of working-class families, were packed with small wooden houses and family workshops. Alleys barely wide enough for two men to pass separated homes built of paper screens and cedar beams. Once the incendiaries struck, fire leapt roof to roof like sparks across dry grass. The devil's wind from the northeast fanned each blaze into a gale. Flames converged into columns, columns into walls, until the neighbourhoods themselves seemed to breathe fire. Air temperatures on the ground reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Tatami mats, futons, rice paper doors, every object became fuel. Entire blocks were consumed in minutes. For civilians, the first instinct was to fight. Bucket brigades lined up, passing pails of water up stairwells. School children, drilled in firefighting, swung bamboo poles at incendiary canisters, trying to pry them from floorboards before their sticky gel spread. But the canisters burned too hot. Water boiled off. Flames clung to wood and flesh alike. Firefighters who attempted to smother the flames with sand collapsed from heat stroke or suffocation. By 12:15 a.m., organised firefighting had ceased. The city's pumps failed as mains burst. Buckets sat empty. Now the only choice was flight. But escape was almost impossible. Narrow lanes clogged with carts and bicycles, mothers clutching infants, the elderly shuffling with canes. Those who fled toward canals found bridges aflame. Those who ran toward open fields discovered the fires were faster. The heat bent air itself, creating whirlwinds of flame that swept people off their feet. At Sumida River, thousands crowded the banks, desperate to cross. Families plunged into the water, clinging to rafts or debris. Many drowned, pulled under by panicked neighbours. Others died from thermal shock, their lungs scalded as they gasped for air above the boiling surface. One survivor later recalled, "The river was full of people. They were on fire even in the water." The firestorm grew self-sustaining. Rising columns of hot air drew oxygen from the edges, pulling winds at hurricane force. Roofs were torn off by suction. Flames jumped fire breaks hundreds of feet wide. Debris became missiles, hurled through the night by wind and heat. Above, B-29 crews could see it all. The city glowed brighter than dawn. Smoke plumes towered into the stratosphere. Pilots wore goggles against the glare. A gunner from the 314th Bomb Wing later recalled, It looked like we had set the world on fire. We could feel the heat in the plain at 5,000 feet. Civilians, trapped in basements and bomb shelters, discovered that safety underground meant death by suffocation. Air was consumed in minutes. Families were found in clusters, huddled together, asphyxiated before flames even reached them. Those who remained above ground faced the opposite fate. Eyewitnesses described people bursting into flame as if ignited from within, their clothes vaporizing. In later surveys, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey estimated air temperatures high enough to melt copper and incinerate bone. By 1:30 a.m., Tokyo was no longer a city, but a firestorm. 16 square miles burned in a single sweep. The wards east of the Imperial Palace, once bustling with factories, schools, markets, had become a single sheet of fire. Incredibly, the bombers were still arriving. Streams of B-29s continued until nearly 2:30 a.m., each adding more incendiaries to the inferno below. By then, there was nothing left to ignite, only a sea of embers and smoke. But to American planners, saturation was essential. Destroy not only buildings, but the city's will to resist. For survivors, there was no such calculation, only chaos. At the edge of Ueno Park, people gathered in open ground, clutching bundles. Flames licked the treetops, cherry blossoms shriveling in the heat. Mothers pressed children's faces to the ground, shielding them with their bodies. A priest at a nearby temple wrote afterward, "It was not war. It was the end of the world." By dawn, the flames still roared, though the bombing had ended hours earlier. Winds carried embers miles away, igniting stray fires across suburbs. Smoke choked the sky. American reconnaissance planes arriving at daylight recorded an unbroken field of ash. Photographs showed only a blackened void where neighborhoods had stood. Estimates would later vary, but the destruction was without precedent. Nearly 100,000 people perished in a single night. Over 1 million were left homeless. 16 square miles of Tokyo were reduced to cinders. More area destroyed in one raid than in the firebombing of Dresden or Hamburg. What Tokyoites had believed impossible had happened. The capital of the empire, the seat of the chrysanthemum throne, had been reduced to ashes overnight. And yet, the city was only the first target. Dawn, March 10th, 1945. The sun rose over Tokyo not to reveal a city, but a wasteland. Where once stood neighborhoods of tightly packed homes and workshops, there now stretched a desert of ash and rubble. Entire wards had vanished. Chimneys jutted up like gravestones. Street grids were visible only as blackened scars cutting through grey ruin. The eastern districts of Honjo and Fukagawa, once teeming with life, were silent except for the crackle of cooling debris. The smell hit first, an overwhelming stench of charred wood, burned tatami mats, and something far worse, the odour of human flesh. Survivors gagged as they stumbled through wreckage. Many carried bundles of possessions, singed and worthless, clutched as though they could anchor lives that no longer existed. Everywhere lay bodies. Some sprawled in streets, curled as if asleep. Others were fused together, indistinguishable lumps of blackened bone and cloth. Along canals, corpses floated by the hundreds, their limbs tangled. On the Sumida River's banks, families had died in clusters, huddled against sea walls, overcome by smoke or heat. The official count, compiled months later by Japanese police and municipal workers, estimated around 87,000 dead in a single night. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey raised the figure closer to 100,000. Post-war Japanese testimonies suggested even higher. But for those who walked the streets that morning, numbers meant nothing. What they saw was annihilation. At Ueno Park, where families had sought shelter beneath cherry blossoms, ashes drifted down like late snow. Trees stood as blackened poles. Beneath them, survivors wept over bodies still warm from the fire. Monks from Kanneji Temple walked among them, chanting prayers, their own robes singed. One wrote in his diary, "We prayed for souls we could not count." In the imperial palace grounds, barely touched by the raid, silence reigned. Emperor Hirohito was informed of the destruction at dawn. His aides described him as impassive, but his ministers were shaken. They had assured the people that the capital was safe, that the empire's spirit would endure any assault. Now the greatest city in Asia lay in ruins from a single night's bombardment. Civilians wandered the ruins in shock. Some searched for relatives, calling names into the smoke. Others carried buckets, still clinging to futile duty, as if the fire brigades might resume. Children clutched charred toys. Mothers carried infants who no longer breathed. The authorities tried to respond. Police patrols gathered survivors into makeshift shelters, schools, shrines, railway stations. Food was scarce. Medical aid almost non-existent. Hospitals had burned with the neighbourhoods. Doctors treated burns with ointments made of cooking oil, water drawn from polluted canals, strips of cloth torn from scorched kimonos. Yet even amid catastrophe, life continued. Vendors reappeared by noon, selling rice balls wrapped in newspaper, tea boiled over campfires. Survivors bartered belongings for food or medicine. Some, hardened by months of privation, scavenged among ruins for anything useful. Iron pots, charred nails, even fragments of aluminum from incendiaries. From the air, reconnaissance flights captured the full scope. US photographers, circling at daylight, recorded a city erased. The film showed 16 square miles of ruin, a scar more visible than the imperial palace itself. Analysts on Guam later compared it to Dresden, Hamburg, and Warsaw, noting that Tokyo had suffered greater damage in one night than any of them. Among American crews who returned from the raid, there was grim satisfaction. Many had flown dozens of high-altitude precision raids with little visible result. This time they had seen the city burn beneath them, felt the heat at 5,000 feet. General Curtis LeMay, receiving reports on Guam, remarked, "We scorched and boiled and baked to death more people in Tokyo that night than went up in vapor at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined." In Tokyo, no such calculations mattered. What remained was trauma. Survivors spoke afterward of nightmares, of hearing the screams of neighbors long after the fire ended. Children grew silent, unable to describe what they had seen. Priests and doctors warned of a spiritual sickness spreading among the displaced. The raid had also destroyed infrastructure critical to survival. Water mains were shattered, electricity gone, tram lines melted. Over 1 million people were homeless in a single morning. Families huddled under makeshift tents of scorched cloth and bamboo. Relief trains brought rice and miso paste from rural prefectures, but supplies vanished instantly. The Japanese government censored news of the devastation, minimizing casualty figures in official bulletins. Yet word spread quickly. Letters carried to other cities told of a sea of fire, of families wiped out, of neighborhoods erased. Refugees arriving in Osaka and Nagoya carried stories more terrifying than any rumor. For many ordinary Japanese, the raid shattered belief that endurance alone would preserve the nation. Tokyo had not been defeated in battle. It had been burned alive from the sky. A factory worker from Fukagawa later told an interrogator in 1946, "That night I knew we could not win. If one night could erase our capital, what chance did we have?" And yet the bombing did not end with Tokyo. Within weeks, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of other cities would face the same fate. The firestorm of March 10th was only the beginning of a campaign designed to burn Japan into surrender. But in Tokyo, on that first morning after, people were too stunned to think of strategy or war. They saw only smoke rising from the blackened earth, carrying with it the ashes of their homes, their families, and their city. Curtis LeMay never believed in half measures. When he assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945, the B-29 campaign against Japan was faltering. Precision bombing at high altitude, the doctrine that had guided the US Army Air Forces over Europe, was proving nearly useless over Japan. The jet stream scattered bombs across miles, targets were dispersed in cottage industries, and results were meagre despite massive losses in aircraft and crews. LeMay had studied German cities, the destruction of Hamburg and Dresden, the success of incendiaries against densely packed urban areas. Japan, he concluded, was even more vulnerable. Nearly 90% of Tokyo's buildings were wood and paper. Industrial output was not confined to large plants, but hidden inside neighborhoods, with women and children laboring in family workshops producing nuts, bolts, and components for the war effort. Destroy the neighborhoods, he argued, and you destroyed the factories. His orders for Operation Meeting House reflected that brutal logic. Strip the B-29s of most defensive guns to increase bomb load. Fly low, at night, beneath the jet stream. Use incendiaries, not high explosives. Saturate, not pinpoint. Tokyo would not be attacked as a city of temples and gardens, but as an industrial organism to be burned out of existence. When reports came in on March 10th, 16 square miles destroyed, 100,000 dead, 1 million homeless, LeMay considered it confirmation. His staff calculated that in one night the operation had achieved more strategic effect than months of precision raids. Within weeks, he expanded the firebombing campaign to Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and beyond. Among Japanese leaders, the raid produced shock and despair. Premier Kuniaki Koiso convened his ministers the following day. Reports from police and army officers were read aloud, describing districts wiped from the map. Cabinet members sat in silence, broken only by murmurs of disbelief. The imperial palace had been spared, but its survival did little to reassure. Hirohito listened to summaries of casualties and destruction. As always, his response was measured, almost clinical, but observers noticed he asked again and again about civilian suffering. His ministers downplayed the figures, but the truth spread quickly enough through the capital. Military commanders debated responses. Could Tokyo be defended more effectively? Night fighters had scrambled, but only a few reached the bombers in time. Anti-aircraft batteries had fired wildly, their shells detonating far below the B-29s. LeMay's gamble, low-altitude saturation, had exploited the weakness of Japan's defences perfectly. Reorganization was ordered, but resources were scarce. Fuel was nearly gone, pilots were exhausted, and the factories that produced weapons had been among the first to burn. Strategically, the Japanese High Command understood what this meant. The war was already turning against them at sea and in the Philippines. Now the home islands themselves were vulnerable not to invasion, but to incineration. If Tokyo could be erased in a single night, no city was safe. To American planners, this was precisely the point. Psychological collapse, as much as industrial destruction, was the goal. Civilian morale had sustained Japan through years of war, bolstered by propaganda of spiritual strength and divine protection. The firestorm stripped that illusion bare. Refugees, pouring into the countryside, carried stories of horror that no censor could fully suppress. Yet within the United States itself, the morality of the raid was debated, even as newspapers celebrated victory. Reports reached Washington that Tokyo had been reduced to ashes. Photographs showed a metropolis obliterated. Some officials privately questioned whether such destruction, visited upon civilians, aligned with the principles for which America claimed to fight. LeMay was unmoved. To his staff, he remarked, "Killing Japanese didn't bother me very much at that time. I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." For him, the calculus was simple: shorten the war, save American lives, end Japanese resistance as swiftly as possible. That logic gained weight as casualty estimates for a land invasion of Japan mounted into the millions. If firebombing Tokyo could break the enemy's will, then the horror was justified by necessity. At least, so went the argument in military councils. For Japan, however, the reckoning was immediate. Tokyo's municipal government was paralyzed, its records incinerated, its offices burned. Relief efforts staggered, unable to cope with the scale of homelessness. The army diverted troops to clear rubble and bury the dead, but the sight of uniformed men piling corpses in ditches underlined the state's impotence. Civilians drew their own conclusions. Many clung to the official narrative of endurance, of the sacred war that must be fought to the end, but others saw only futility. Diaries and post-war testimonies reveal a shift. The firebombing of Tokyo convinced many Japanese that the empire was doomed. Still, the raids continued. Osaka burned next, then Kobe. By July, nearly every major Japanese city had been reduced to rubble. Tokyo, struck again and again, was systematically erased. Operation Meeting House was not the end of the war, but it was the beginning of the end. In one night, LeMay had demonstrated that America's industrial power, applied without restraint, could erase entire cities. The Japanese leadership could ignore battlefield defeats. They could spin propaganda from naval losses. But they could not deny the blackened ruin that lay before them in their own capital. The firestorm of March 10th was more than destruction. It was a message. And for Japan, the message was unmistakable. The war would end not with heroic sacrifice, but with fire from the sky. The inferno that consumed Tokyo on March 9th to 10th, 1945, was not an isolated event. It was the opening blow in a sustained campaign designed to burn Japan's cities into surrender. Operation Meeting House had proved the concept. Low-altitude incendiary raids could annihilate entire urban districts in a single night. Within days, Curtis LeMay and the 21st Bomber Command prepared to repeat the assault across the archipelago. On March 12th, just 2 nights after Tokyo's destruction, the B-29s returned, this time over Nagoya. The city, home to major Mitsubishi aircraft plants and sprawling residential wards, was struck by over 300 bombers. Incendiaries blanketed the urban core, consuming 4 square miles. The Mitsubishi factories survived initial damage, but their surrounding worker housing was obliterated. 2 days later, Osaka burned. As Japan's industrial hub and second-largest city, Osaka had long been considered a prime target. That night, 274 B-29s rained incendiaries across the center, igniting conflagrations visible 150 miles away. Within hours, 8 square miles were gone. On June 1st, another raid destroyed an additional 3.2 square miles. By summer, Osaka was little more than ash and rubble. Kobe followed, its port facilities vital to Japan's shrinking maritime lifelines. On March 17th, 331 B-29s attacked, engulfing the docks and surrounding neighborhoods. 4 square miles vanished. Fires swept through crowded districts where families of dock workers lived in wooden barracks. Survivors remembered watching the harbor water itself catch flame as oil tanks exploded. By late March, Japan's 4 largest cities, Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, had all been scorched within weeks. But LeMay did not stop with the metropolises. He reasoned that Japan's war production was so decentralized that even smaller cities housed crucial workshops. In April and May, the firestorm spread to medium-sized cities, Kawasaki, Yokohama, Nagoya, again, and others. Each raid obliterated neighborhoods, erased infrastructure, and displaced tens of thousands. On May 23rd to 25th, Tokyo itself was struck again in 3 successive raids. Over 500 bombers attacked each night, dropping thousands of tons of incendiaries. The raids destroyed another 22 square miles. By June, more than half of Tokyo lay in ashes. The capital that once housed nearly 7 million people had been reduced to a shell of ruins, its survivors scattered into makeshift camps or rural villages. By July, the campaign broadened further. In a single coordinated series of raids, 60 Japanese cities were attacked. Toyama, an industrial town of 128,000, was 99% destroyed in one night. Hamamatsu lost 60% of its urban area, Fukui 80%, Niigata 65%. The names multiplied. Okazaki, Himeji, Chiba, each added to the growing list of cities reduced to smoking rubble. By August 1945, the results were staggering. According to the US Strategic Bombing Survey, 66 Japanese cities had been attacked with incendiaries. On average, 40% of each city's urban area had been destroyed. In total, over 178 square miles of urban Japan had been burned to ash. The human toll defied comprehension. Estimates placed civilian deaths from firebombing at over 300,000, with millions more injured or rendered homeless. Families were scattered, records lost, whole neighborhoods erased. Rural prefectures absorbed waves of refugees who strained already meager food supplies. A Japanese police report from July 1945 described the national condition bluntly. The urban population has collapsed. Factories cannot operate for lack of workers. Families live in ruins or flee to the countryside. Morale is shaken everywhere. For civilians, the fire campaign meant more than physical destruction. It meant uprooting. Millions fled from urban centres to rural areas, carrying what little they could salvage. Trains clogged with refugees, children packed into freight cars, mothers clutching bundles. Many found only hostility in the countryside, where farmers themselves were starving. Villages resented the influx of mouths to feed. Children were evacuated by government decree, sent to temple schools or distant relatives. Thousands never saw their parents again. Teachers recalled rows of silent students, eyes hollow from nights of terror in burning cities. Daily life collapsed into improvisation. Food lines stretched for blocks. Potable water was scarce. Families dug wells in ruins or drank from polluted canals. Disease spread: dysentery, pneumonia, malnutrition. By mid-1945, entire districts of Tokyo resembled refugee camps. The firebombing campaign also broke illusions of protection. Civilians who had once trusted in the air defense system realized its impotence. Sirens wailed night after night, yet bombers arrived unchallenged. Propaganda that promised divine winds and spiritual resilience rang hollow against the sight of entire cities consumed. Survivors described a creeping sense of inevitability. "We no longer asked if the bombers would come," one woman later testified, "only when and how long we had left." Another survivor from Nagoya wrote in his diary, "The war is lost. The city is gone. We live only until the next raid." From LeMay's perspective, the campaign was achieving its goal. Japan's industrial output plummeted as workshops and supply chains vanished. Rail transport, disrupted by destroyed urban hubs, slowed to a crawl. Civilian morale, once thought unbreakable, cracked under the weight of unrelenting terror. Yet in Tokyo and in rural villages alike, many Japanese clung to hope or resignation that the war would end before the nation itself disappeared in fire. For some, the raids convinced them surrender was inevitable. For others, the suffering only deepened their commitment to endure, no matter the cost. By the summer of 1945, Japan's cities were gone, its people shattered, its leaders cornered. But the firestorm campaign had not yet delivered surrender. That final blow would come from another weapon entirely, one more terrible than firebombs. By July 1945, much of Japan's urban fabric had already been reduced to ash. 66 cities had been burned, millions displaced, and industrial production crippled. Yet the government still refused unconditional surrender. For American planners, the question became, what more could force capitulation? The answer arrived not in fleets of B-29s, but in a single aircraft carrying a weapon unlike anything seen before. General Curtis LeMay believed the incendiary campaign had already achieved strategic victory. His 21st Bomber Command could level a city in a night, and the data was irrefutable. Production collapsed, transportation disintegrated, civilian morale fractured. He later reflected bluntly, "We had already won the war by firebombing Japan." But Washington's calculus had shifted. The Manhattan Project had produced 2 atomic bombs by midsummer 1945. Where LeMay's raids required hundreds of aircraft and thousands of tons of bombs, the new weapon promised equivalent destruction from a single payload. To Japanese civilians, already enduring near-nightly raids, the distinction seemed at first almost academic. Their cities were already flattened, their neighborhoods charred ruins. Yet the atomic bomb would carry symbolic power far beyond its physical blast. At 8:15 a.m., August 6th, a lone B-29 named Enola Gay appeared above Hiroshima. Unlike the roaring armadas of LeMay's raids, only a handful of planes approached. Civilians assumed it was another reconnaissance flight and continued morning routines. Moments later, a blinding flash split the sky. Windows shattered across the city, followed by a rolling wave of heat so intense it melted roof tiles and seared human shadows into stone. A mushroom cloud climbed miles into the atmosphere. Within seconds, 70,000 people were dead. Another 70,000 would die from burns and radiation in the following months. The destruction resembled firebombing in its completeness. Wooden houses vanished, flames swept outward. But the mechanism was different. Survivors recalled not waves of incendiaries, but an instant of white light, as if the sun itself had descended. 3 days later, the second bomb struck Nagasaki. Again, the effect was total. 40,000 killed instantly, tens of thousands more fatally wounded. Factories were obliterated, neighborhoods vaporized. For a population already hollowed by firebombs and hunger, the atomic bombs appeared as a final, otherworldly blow. Japanese leaders debated furiously. Some argued the bombs were merely an extension of fire raids. Terrible, yes, but not fundamentally different from what LeMay had already wrought on Tokyo or Osaka. Others recognized something new, a weapon so singular that no defense, no endurance could counter it. For ordinary Japanese, the difference between the March firestorm and the August bombs was one of experience. Survivors of Tokyo's raid remembered a long night of running, choking, and fighting for air. Hiroshima survivors spoke of an instant of annihilation followed by silence, then a world transformed into dust and flames. One Tokyo schoolteacher evacuated to Hiroshima later testified, "In Tokyo, the fire chased us through the streets. In Hiroshima, the fire fell from the sky all at once. There was no escape." Psychologically, the bombs collapsed the last illusion that Japan might negotiate survival on its own terms. If America could burn 60 cities with fire and still escalate to weapons that destroyed with a single plane, then no city, no refuge, no endurance could matter. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded that firebombing alone might have forced surrender by November 1945. But the atomic bombs compressed time. They provided Japan's leaders with a face-saving rationale for surrender. Not that the military had failed, but that a new, unstoppable weapon had rendered further resistance futile. Emperor Hirohito himself cited the atomic bomb in his surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945. He spoke of a weapon capable of destroying the very fabric of the nation, avoiding mention of the months of fire raids that had already done just that. Statistically, the Tokyo raid of March 9th to 10th killed more civilians than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki individually. Yet the atomic bombs left an impression of singular godlike force. Firebombing represented industrial inevitability, hundreds of bombers, thousands of airmen, rivers of gasoline and explosives. The atomic bomb represented something else, scientific finality, a new age of warfare where destruction came in a single stroke. For Japanese survivors, both were unforgettable. For American planners, both were decisive. Together they formed the twin blades that cut short the war. In post-war Japan, the memory of firebombing often receded into the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bomb became the symbol of defeat and the focus of commemoration. Yet for survivors of Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other cities, the memory of March through August 1945 was one of unrelenting fire, hunger, and displacement. One survivor of Tokyo later remarked at a reunion in 1985, "People remember Hiroshima because of the atom, but in Tokyo 100,000 died in one night. We were burned just as surely, only without a mushroom cloud." By the end of August 1945, Japan lay prostrate. The firebombing campaign had already broken its cities and its people. The atomic bombs shattered the will of its leaders. Together, they marked the final collapse of a nation once certain of its spiritual resilience. For American commanders, the lesson was clear. Abundance and innovation, whether in fleets of B-29s or in the science of the atom, could overwhelm even the fiercest enemy. For Japan, the legacy was ash, memory, and a vow never to be consumed by fire again. When Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over Japanese radios on August 15, 1945, announcing surrender, the nation listening was already broken. Millions gathered around speakers in burned-out neighborhoods, in schoolhouses with shattered roofs, in refugee camps built from salvaged wood. They wept, bowed, or sat silently. They were not hearing surrender in the abstract. They were living inside the ruins. Tokyo alone had lost more than 100,000 dead in the March raid, and hundreds of thousands of homes across subsequent nights of fire. In Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama, blackened shells of factories lined rivers where children scavenged twisted iron. Entire wards had been reduced to little more than foundations and chimneys poking through the rubble. The Ministry of Welfare estimated in September 1945 that 8.5 million people were homeless nationwide. Even before the atomic bombs, firebombing had hollowed out the very possibility of normal life. In August, it was not unusual to see office workers carrying bent pots, former shopkeepers living in makeshift huts near the burned foundations of their shops, or farmers trading rice for scraps of corrugated tin. The survivors of the Tokyo firestorm described their city in those first weeks as a flat wasteland. Charred telephone poles leaned like black matchsticks. Bridges were clogged with the carcasses of burned streetcars. Water cisterns overflowed with ashes. Ponds in Ueno and Sumida districts contained skeletons that had boiled alive when firestorms consumed the air. For children, the destruction was normalized almost immediately. A 10-year-old survivor recalled in a 1946 interview with Allied social workers, "I thought cities were supposed to look this way, flat, black, nothing left. I did not know they could be tall. Schools reopened in ruins. Lessons were held under tarps stretched across playgrounds. Teachers wrote on salvaged planks with chalk. Every morning began with the clearing of rubble." When American occupation forces entered Tokyo in late August, they were stunned by the scale of destruction. General Douglas MacArthur, landing at Atsugi Airfield on August 30th, saw from his transport plane the endless brown-black scars of firebombed wards. From the air, Tokyo looked more devastated than Manila, Warsaw, or Berlin. Occupation planners quickly realized reconstruction would be a generational task. Housing topped the agenda. The Ministry of Health and Welfare reported in October 1945 that over 25% of urban housing stock had been destroyed, with Tokyo at nearly 50%. The U.S. Army Civil Affairs Division pressed Japan's government to launch emergency housing programs. Prefabricated barracks were erected, but demand vastly exceeded supply. Families lived under bridges, in railway tunnels, and inside gutted trolley cars. Food scarcity compounded the crisis. Japan's 1945 rice harvest was the lowest in a decade. Distribution collapsed as urban transport systems remained crippled. Millions turned to black markets. By late 1945, An estimated 50% of Tokyo's food passed through illegal street stalls, where rice sold for 20 times official prices. Fuel shortages were equally dire. Winter 1945–46 saw families burning furniture, tatami mats, and even books to keep warm. Allied surveys recorded dozens of deaths from exposure each week in the coldest months. In this chaos, memory of the firebombing lingered as both trauma and explanation. Survivors often told occupation officials, "We suffer now because our houses were burned." The ruins of March 9th to 10th had become a shorthand for all subsequent hardship. Yet public discourse about the firebombing remained muted. Occupation censors discouraged open discussion of civilian suffering that might complicate the narrative of Japan as aggressor. Newspapers published photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but rarely of Tokyo's charred wards. Still, memory persisted in private. Families marked March 10th each year with quiet offerings at home altars. Survivors' groups slowly formed, though they lacked political recognition. In interviews decades later, many remembered a sense of being silenced twice. Once by wartime propaganda urging them to endure without complaint, and again by post-war narratives emphasizing atomic trauma over incendiary fire. Despite shortages, rebuilding began almost immediately. The Tokyo Metropolitan Government launched the War Damage Reconstruction Plan in 1946, envisioning wide boulevards, modern apartment blocks, and fireproof neighborhoods. In practice, limited resources forced compromises. By 1947, most construction consisted of small wooden houses built from scavenged materials. Still, progress was visible. By 1950, Tokyo's population had rebounded to 6.2 million, nearly pre-war levels. Commerce returned. Streetcars ran again along charred avenues. The blackened shells of factories were replaced by humming workshops, many repurposed to supply the American military in Korea after 1950. For ordinary survivors, resilience was expressed in daily acts. A family that lost everything in March 1945 might open a tea stand on a corner by September. Children who had carried buckets in fire drills returned to classrooms where teachers emphasized peace, discipline, and cooperation. The firebombing also reshaped culture. Writers like Yoko Ota and Tamiki Hara, though associated primarily with atomic bomb literature, inspired Tokyo survivors to write their own accounts. In visual arts, paintings of blackened ruins emerged as a distinct post-war genre. Yet the trauma also bred silence. Many survivors reported nightmares of smoke and fire for decades, but rarely spoke of them publicly. Psychologists interviewing survivors in the 1960s noted high rates of survivors' guilt. People haunted by memories of family or neighbors consumed in the firestorms. Architects and planners drew sobering lessons. Wooden housing, which comprised 87% of Tokyo in 1945, was identified as the single greatest vulnerability. Post-war zoning regulations emphasized fire breaks, steel and concrete. New Tokyo grew vertically, with reinforced apartment blocks replacing rows of wooden homes. American planners pointed out the irony. The firestorm that had destroyed the city also forced it toward modernization. Without such destruction, they argued, Tokyo might have rebuilt itself as another sprawling, flammable metropolis. Globally, the Tokyo raid was overshadowed by the atomic bombings. But military historians in both Japan and the US recognized its significance. At a 1962 US-Japanese aviation symposium, former Japanese officers admitted the March 9th to 10th raid had more immediate impact on morale than Hiroshima. One colonel remarked, "We could imagine defending against a single bomb. We could not imagine defending against 1,000. American veterans of the 21st Bomber Command likewise recalled Tokyo as their most harrowing mission. Crewmen who dropped incendiaries spoke decades later of the orange glow visible from 150 miles away, the turbulence from rising fire columns, and the knowledge that entire neighborhoods vanished below. By the 1980s, as Japan emerged as an economic power, survivors of the Tokyo firebombing began organizing memorial events. They insisted their trauma be remembered alongside Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1985, at a Pacific Theater veterans reunion in Hawaii, a Tokyo survivor told an American B-29 veteran, "We burned the same as they burned in Hiroshima. Fire is fire." The long shadow of March 1945 was not simply about destruction. It was about endurance, silence, and the gradual rebuilding of a society from ashes. In that sense, the firebombing shaped not only Japan's defeat, but also its post-war resilience. The aftermath of Tokyo's firestorm was measured in homelessness, hunger, and silence. Yet from ruins grew a new Japan, rebuilt not in wood but in steel, and resolved, if never entirely at peace with memory, that fire would never again consume its cities. For survivors, the night of March 9th to 10th was never just history. It was the moment that defined every struggle and every step of reconstruction that followed.